O objetivo do painel é estimular.
The objective of the panel is to stimulate reflections about the proposals brought forward in the ABDE 2030 plan, based on the perspectives of economists about the topic of development. This discussion will count on representatives of the technical teams connected to the main presidential candidates for the elections of 2022. We have Germano Rigotto, an attorney, a former governor of Rio Grande do Sul, former state representative and federal representative. Guilherme Mello, professor of the Department of Political and Economical History of the University of Campinas and member of the Nucleus for Public Policy of Perseu Abramo Foundation. Nelson Marconi, professor of the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, FGV, coordinator of the Executive Center of Studies. Zeina Latif, founder and consultant of Gibraltar Consultoria and former chief economist of XP Investimentos. We also have Jair Marques, president of Desenvolve GBT, and Paulo Costa, president of Desenbahia and director of ABDE. This panel will be moderated by José Luis Gordon, executive secretary of ABDE. Welcome. You have the floor, dear executive secretary of Mr. Gordon. He will explain the dynamics of the panel. Thank you. Good morning to all of the members of the panel. I would like to greet our directors, Jair and Paulo. It is a pleasure to ABDE to hold this debate based on the ABDE 2030 plan. It was presented in the previous panel, and it places the national development system as a relevant stakeholder for the Sustainable Development Agenda and promoting this debate for the future of the country and a contribution of ABDE to the country. So we've brought the best of the best to debate this plan, to hear from them, to see what they think about the plan. We have economists and advisors to presidential candidates, and it's very important for us to have this event so that we can take this agenda to the campaigns, which are so important. I thank you very much for your presence. Dynamics will be very simple and straightforward. We'll have some questions to you. These questions will be asked by our directors here representing the members of the ABDE, and to each question you will have 3 minutes to reply. I will be very strict with time so that we can all have the same time to answer. So when we are 20 or 30 seconds from the end, I'll let you know. So we'll start in an alphabetic order, and then in the second question is the opposite of the alphabetic order, and then alphabetic order again, and at the end we'll have some time for your considerations. So I'd like to thank you once again. This is the beginning of a debate. This plan is just the beginning of a whole journey ABDE is proposing. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our director, who is the chairman of Desenvolve MT, Mr. Jair, to ask you a first question. It is a great pleasure to be here representing our members. We have our institution here represented ABDE. So for us, it's a very unique moment because we are having this important discussion. We have been seeing this subject develop for many years, and we in ABDE are presenting a great results in this. In Mato Grosso, we are starting to advance a lot in this discussion as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Dr. Janete, our friend Luis, and our team in Cuiabá was watching us over the internet. My question for our guests is, the ABDE Plan 2030 brings a number of proposals so that we can think about a more sustainable and inclusive result. In the document, the National Development System has a central role for the fulfilling of the SDGs and there are 5 proposed missions. Considering the ABDE 2030 plan, which measures do you propose for the financial agenda, uh, the, the agenda for funding sustainability, and what is the role we should have in the implementation? So first to answer will be the governor, and then Professor Agela, and then Nelson, and lastly Professor Zeina. First of all, I'd like to thank the invitation made by the ABDE to participate in this meeting. I'm here as a coordinator of the government plan of Senator Rosane Tabic. I represent what we are considering regarding the development banks and agencies, as well as the work of ABDE. I would like to thank for the invitation and greet President Janete Lontra. I'm very happy to come in contact with Janete's work in Badesul. Since when I was a governor, I am familiar with her work, and on her behalf, I'd like to greet the board, the members, and everyone who is watching this event here at live and remotely as well. We have on YouTube also a very substantial participation. Jair, Paulo, greetings to you too, and my fellow panelists, Guilherme Mello, Nelson Marconi, and Zeina Latif. Thank you all. I have studied a lot about the work conducted by ABDE, and this question of how the development banks can effectively enter strongly this plan and the Sustainable Development Plan. I have read it thoroughly, and it will be very useful for the work we are conducting in the government plan. Senator Simone Tecce has a very serious concern with sustainability. She is from Mato Grosso do Sul, and she has a very strong connection with agribusiness, but a huge concern with sustainable development. And sustainable development should mean to tackle the problems that ABDE presents in this plan.
We have targets. Five targets that include effectively the intelligent and inclusive digital future. This digital future that is inclusive and smart is completely related to sustainable development. So digitization, especially of micro and small companies, the digitization of cities that need to become increasingly smart cities, where the population will have, with transparency and digitization, more efficient services and greater control over public authorities. And so this point of digitization that goes through companies and public authorities, I have no doubt that development institutions have a role that private banks don't. When I see development institutions playing a key role in the modernization of public management, we see that it is development agencies and banks that have, along the past years, been financing the modernization of public management. Around 90% of resources channeled towards modernization of public management comes from development agencies. Now, 30 seconds is not enough. So the innovation and ecosystem and bioeconomy for the Amazon is completely related to what we seek in terms of sustainable development. Now, talking about infrastructure and sustainable cities, in infrastructure today, when we talk about PPs, PP partnerships, PPPs and privatizations, we know that today it is development banks, and BNDES plays a key role. They're helping in the modeling for privatizations and PPPs. And so it's an important role in any government, and this is has been our focus. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you, representing the debate we've been having at my institution, where I coordinate the economics department. I was very pleased with the invitation because the discussion around the model and style of development and how to equip the state in order to implement this model. This is precisely the discussion we're having at the Perseu Abramo institution. And so the idea of organizing the SDGs based on 5 missions, mission economics, as contained in the document already present. This is part of the plan launched in 2020, aligned with the discussion of development plans based on missions. So obviously, with the 17 SDGs and all the targets, of course, that's a starting point for organizing instruments and state instruments and organizations in order to achieve this mission and conclude these missions and advance on the goals established in international agreements. And a central element, a key element of this model is financing. Of course, the topic of financing entails both the public sector and the private sector. And we cannot think that, we should not think that the size of the challenge ahead of us can exclude the private or the public. There needs to be complementation and synergy between or among the instruments available. As stated in your document, synergy needs to be built not only among national players but also international players, because the topic of sustainable development is a topic that unifies global economic debate nowadays. So it is present in the American discussion, in the Biden plan, in the Green New Deal, in the European discussion, in the Next Generation EU, and also in the investment packages of countries such as China, which today leads the topic of energy transition. It's going to produce around 50% of solar energy in the future, and we have a huge domestic potential to make the best of our economic, social, and environmental characteristics, to build this agenda and make it into an engine, a driver of national development. It's not only about reducing costs, reducing damage reduction, which is necessary for the planet to survive, but it's actually one of the central pillars of development. And my last 30 seconds now on financing. I believe that it is a priority to strengthen national banks, state banks, regional development agencies, and build synergy around these objectives, both institutionally inside the banks and institutions, but also the instruments, the financing instruments, the shared financing instruments that they can build in order to facilitate private investment and enable well-structured projects in the public sector. Professor Nelson, you have the floor. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for ABDE for the invitation. Greeting all my colleagues. I am participating as coordinator of the government plan of pre-candidate Ciro Gomes, and I'm very pleased. I was very pleased when I received the plan and saw that it is actually structured on development axes linked to sustainability, and more than that, defining sectors that are important for development. So this is a characteristic that was present in our 2018 government plan, and sectors defined here are entirely compatible with the sectors that we had identified back then. Before addressing financing, I'd like to say that we need to understand, and here I'd like to pause and congratulate ABDE for its plan. We need to understand that development and sustainability are complementary. They are not competing objectives, and this is increasingly clear, and it's quite clear in your project when you mention innovation, bioeconomy, engaged agribusiness, etc., health, and also inclusion and digital inclusion. So it is very important to have all these, to contemplate all these sectors in the process of development. I'm very pleased with this, and I agree entirely. This matches all the axes that we have defined in our, and priorities we defined in our plan, with few differences. Now, specifically on financing, we have a national development system, as you mentioned, and it is important for all agencies to work together, and together with the plan, with BNDES. So these major initiatives, BNDES in the last few years has been weakened in its financing capacity, and so this needs to be strengthened. So the agencies and BNDES. So the projects that are going to be financed, and if you allow me to make a suggestion, they need to be compatible with a broader strategy for development. So I understand that the idea, well, my suggestion actually, in order to enable this financing, is the construction of a network, a kind of project office that would integrate BNDES and other development agencies, and this project office would approve the most important projects linked to a national development strategy with these characteristics that you mentioned. And so the projects that would compete for funding would be linked to this more general financing strategy. So it would be very important to work along these lines, and of course with monitoring of the budget, because there is, in Brazil, very often the budget is not linked to the physical execution of the projects, and so it would be very important to set up such an office. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Nelson. Dr. Zeina. Good morning. It's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to mention that I am part of the economic team of the campaign of João Doria. So not all that I say here is the consensus vision of the group. And so it's important. It's an important effort to connect agendas of development banks and agencies to the world discussion of the SDGs, as Guilherme mentioned. So this insertion is important also to reduce the isolation that Brazil experiences from the global agenda. So first, congratulations on this effort. I will agree with Nelson that it is very important to coordinate and explore synergies, and in order to prevent overlapping of programs, and also make the best of the experience and expertise of each bank and agency. Now I'd like to bring up other aspects related to the role of development banks. In short, we are talking about operations or action where the in segments and where the private sector will not be interested at all, or perhaps just very little, and so identifying market gaps. It's not easy, especially in Brazil, where many market gaps have been created by ourselves with mistaken regulation, mistaken state action. When we create a business environment that is difficult with a lot of legal uncertainty, this of course will affect investment decisions and overburden the public banks and development banks. And so the best would be for us to advance on an agenda that is moving very, very slowly. Secondly, no doubt, this state action is important when we identify that certain investment or action will bring returns for society greater than private returns. So it's not about profit, it's about introducing social well-being. This, of course, will justify state intervention. Now, having said this, in this compliance with pursuit of SDGs, it's very important to define where it is actually worthwhile for development banks and agencies to act, and also based on more precise diagnoses. And so a first possibility, an initial possibility, is for all the initiatives and public policies. It's very important to have studies on the return to society. We are talking about public funds that are fed by public financing. It is key to have cost-benefit analyses on the return of each action, each development institution, in a very transparent manner, conveying this to society. So for each public policy, whatever it is, in the executive or in the... So conducting such a study, especially through independent commissions,
with the academia, and to identify which should move on, which should be discontinued, what needs to be rearranged, and which experiences can be replicated. So successful experiences can be replicated. Time's up. Thank you. Moving on with our questions, I'd like to give the floor to the chairman of Desenbahia and director of ABDE, Dr. Paulo Costa. We in ABDE, Gordon and his team, has translated the points of ABDE in missions, so it's easier to understand and easier to contemplate the targets. It was a very nice approach. I would like to understand. Well, Nelson addressed it a little bit, and Zeina as well. What we are developing in this plan, and the 2030 plan, how does this dialogue with your planning? What are we missing and you're not? What do we have to contribute to your plans? And I'd like to see to learn from you how related your current work is to our 2030 plan. So I believe that planning is a broader concept, and you might have things in mind that we have not added to the plan, so we would like to know what we have. We start now with Dr. Zeina. I confess that uh, I'm having some trouble in organizing my answer. Can you make a more objective question? How is our plan, which is a planning tool, interacts with your planning, the planning you're making for a future government if your candidate ends up winning the election? Do your plans and our plan relate somehow? Are they convergent? Are they divergent? Almost like a continuation of the previous question. Yes, the sound cut was cut, so I didn't get the first part of the question, but now I understand it. Thank you. Well, today in the private sector, in the public sector as well, we have both sectors embracing the SDGs principles, which guarantees the insertion of the topics in the global agenda. I'm sorry for the digression, but for example, after the Mercosur and European Union, that depends a lot on advancing in these matters, environmental matters. So we cannot be alienated to that because of our reality and because of the agenda that imposed. I believe that the sustainable development goals are being embraced by the private sector, but very possibly we will need some public policy to make it feasible, especially when we consider the social aspect. The environmental aspect, I believe that there are many challenges involved, but the pathways seem to be clearer in terms of financial instruments. But in terms of the social area, it's more complex. I believe that there is a need for a state action, not necessarily in terms of funding, but in terms of legislation, in terms of uh, improving legal safety and facilitating the participation of enterprises. And there is also some space for the design of public policies. Oftentimes we see public policies being designed, but with very little concern for environmental topics. Maybe this is yet another digression, but just to give you an example. For example, we have a housing program. Previously, it was called My Life, My House, and the environmental concern was basically inexistent, and the social aspect was inexistent as well. So you're building housing far away from the center without transportation infrastructure, so people are marginalized because of that, and also without any concern for the environment. And I understand that in, in the perspective of financing, this mapping of where we need some type of funding design. For example, we have the idea of making something blended jointly with the private sector. So one thing that is in the plan is a partnership with international mechanisms is fundamental, partnerships with the private sector, and I would add, well, not necessarily in terms of funding, but provision of guarantees and safeguards. I believe that we have a broad range, a whole range of activities, but absolutely we have a lot of points of contacts, and these concerns of the plan are in our discussions as well on how we can potentialize the development of the country while paying attention to the SDG principles. Give the floor to Professor Nelson. Professor Nelson, you have the floor. Thank you. Well, first, I believe that there is a coincidence here, which with our program, which is the fact that you have defined a plan or the program or a national development system, and this is within the context of development, a more general development plan, which you have presented today, the general lines of the major concerns, and this is absolutely compatible with what we have. Since 2018, we are calling our program a National Development Plan. And in our program of government, we have always had targets. development targets connected to the SDGs. It is yet another feature, another point of contact, and very compatible between two instances, and we are establishing these targets based on the general growth target and other indicators as well. So this is a suggestion, maybe to add in your general plan some growth targets. One other thing that is very important, and I would say that is compatible as well, is what I said in my first response. This synchronization between sustainability and development. And the analysis of all of the projects based on the return to the society. So it's a cost-benefit analysis not only for the private sector, but for public sector as well. Is one thing that you have added to your plan. And I would also suggest that in terms of the growth targets, it would be important, if we are talking about a national development system, it would be important to discuss funding, sources of funding, and sources of resources to feed the system. And I believe this is included in a more general problem of funding of the public sector. And this is something I would suggest to go through in the plan, otherwise the system will continue to be weakened, will not be as strong in terms of resources. And the other thing I had to say, which is interesting, is to have a discussion about the expenditure in technology. So we are talking about innovation, so in the other end we need to have an innovation policy, a national policy for science and technology, including relationships with startups, universities and businesses, research institutions of the private sector. So I would emphasize what we call the policy for development and innovation, so that it's made compatible with your national development system. Thank you, Nelson. Guilherme? Thank you for your question. My first response, I already talked about one similarity, which is the organization of the idea of the style of development, referenced by Aníbal Pinto, which is the style of development is guided by missions. And this is present in our plan and is present in ABDE's plan. So these are social environmental missions. It's not social or environmental. Two aspects complement each other. And a second key feature is a discussion about the centrality of financial mechanisms available in the public sector to coordinate this process, where I think that there can be complementary aspects, not so clearly in the document, but it will be developed in our program as well. But I also think that future discussions as well. What is the role of the state? This is one question. The activity of the state, which is capable of coordinating and influencing in a partnership with the private sector, is a fundamental topic for us to discuss this huge challenge that we have had. Because if you look at the TCC panel days ago, the climate emergency is something that we can't postpone. And in the case of Brazil, the social emergency is also very prominent. So poverty, hunger, the quality of nutrition. So we have to discuss a concept that will make possible for us to have a package of investments that is capable of facing these emergencies. And I agree with Nelson, we need to discuss the mechanisms for funding the state. Our current fiscal or tax framework has reduced investment to the lowest levels in history. It provides for the depreciation of capitals. It's one of the smallest levels of lowest levels of public investment in Latin America. It's a tax framework that is not compatible with the investments that we need. We need high quality investments. So these projects need to be very well structured in terms of their impacts, and they have to be followed as well in the implementation and results. To provide meaning to the activity of the state, one other fundamental aspect present in the document is the role of the national funds for development. And these funds have been criminalized in Brazil, stating that we need to end the funds, but they are actually fundamental not only for funding from banks and funding agencies, but also for funding the themes of science and technology. Let's see if in the third question I can go back to address other topics. To our plan of government, this is still being developed, many hands and many brains, not only with the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, but the many different sectors of society that can contribute. It's not something for a specific political party, but rather a debate with society. So the baseline of our government plan is education. The main pillar for sustainable development is educational policy, first childhood and higher education. So when we receive this plan of sustainable development that has everything to do with the 2030 development agenda, of course this work will serve as a basis for what we are doing. But I'm sure that what Guilherme said, we're living two very important moments, which is development, which is actually the moment to tackle environmental problems and climatic problems that have been seriously aggravated. This is why development has to be sustainable and has to be wary of the environment. This is all involved, but there is also an aggravation of the social crisis post-pandemic, which is a huge challenge for the future government. They need to look at the social aspect as well, future governments. And I'm certain that development institutions will have a fundamental role in policy making. And Nelson also mentioned innovation with employment generation and income generation. So they will have a fundamental role for us to face these two issues that challenge us: the climate and the issue of the social crisis, the aggravation of poverty.
When we look at the whole set of actions included in the project, this is related to what we think and what we are producing. Decent work, economic growth, which requires the work of development institutions, and also our fourth industrial revolution, which require heavy investment in technology, innovation, related to sustainable growth, generation of income and employment, battling poverty, as well as infrastructure. The state cannot do everything. So whatever the state is not able to do through PPPs and privatizations, today the banks, the development banks and institutions play a key role in supporting the state, helping the state conduct processes, especially in clear definitions. Zeina mentioned this. We have beautiful projects. We will have even better projects by following this program. But we need a lot of monitoring to know what is really happening on the ground, whether the resources are being used correctly, and so it's important to monitor. Thank you. Now the last question, and Both Zeina and Nelson have already addressed this important point. So how do you see the role of the national development system in the SDGs in attracting resources? So through multilateral institutions, such as the French Development Agency, the Fomplata, KfW, other institutions represented here, IDB, a major partner. How do you see in your government plans, how do you see this in, attracting resources through multilateral resources, but also through innovative instruments such as green bonds, social bonds, other instruments such as sustainable development instruments and for raising resources? And so how do you see the role of the system and how to strengthen the system in order to attract resources? Governor, you're the first. So I start and I finish, right? So well, there's the fact that today there's the possibility of international financing. When we talk about environment and sustainability, when we require from Brazil sustainable development and care with the Amazon, I have no doubt that there are international resources available, and we need to know how to attract these resources. Who will be the next president of Brazil needs to be on the side of those at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Development Ministry, as well as development institutions that will be responsible for distributing and managing these resources. And so I have no doubt that there are resources available. And when we talk about financing, we need to look at what happened during the pandemic. During the pandemic, we had to help especially micro and small companies. And who extended the arm of the state to these companies? Development institutions. Where did funds come from? From the public sector, public budgets. And so we need to combine the use of public resources appropriately and also the raising of international resources. And so it's a key role for development institutions, especially when we want to look at those who need it most, the micro and small companies, and taking into account the fact that the use of resources today is much more controlled and needs to be more transparent. That's why development institutions need to prepare to provide effective responses, and so that we can all be sure that funds from public budgets or international resources will render the results that we expect. So thank you once again for the opportunity to come here and join you, and I'm at your service. Both Senator Simone Tebet and Helena Landau, which is responsible for the economic part, our whole team is available to receive all types of suggestions. No doubt this document will provide the basis of what we want in order to strengthen the role of development institutions for the future. Professor Guilherme, I believe that the issue of sustainability, as I said, has already mobilized the whole world. Brazil, in the past few years, has been left out not only from the agenda and debate, but also from the capital flow that could help us build infrastructure and institutionality in order to tackle the problem. Obviously, building a model and a style of development focused on social and environmental issues. Zeina mentioned this, and I agree fully. We have an increasing possibility of raising resources from multilateral institutions, international public banks, that we very often are partners with. And this, not only at the national level, but the relationships with these banks occurs directly with governors. We have a former governor who can testify, and with mayors, and obviously in order for this synergy to happen, we need good projects and institutionality that will enable, will facilitate the raising of such resources within the rules established by international organizations. And so this greater synergy of agencies, banks, and funds can also facilitate the raising of such resources for good projects, and also the internalization of the missions, the SDGs, the targets in the institutionality of banks and agencies. I'd like to complement this, saying that I believe this is valid for the public sector, whether federal, state, or municipal level, but it also applies to state-owned companies. This is very important. Let's take a classic case. In our program, we're talking about three transitions: the ecological, the energetic, and the energy and the digital transitions towards the economy of the future. Any society in the future will need to address and find ways to tackle these challenges. And so we have instruments for this. One of them, many countries have, an energy company such as Petrobras. It's a company that should be thinking about the future of energy transition in dialogue with sustainability, but it gradually, actually very quickly, it became a company that exports crude oil with short-term profits but no long-term future, because the long-term future does not reside with fossil fuels. The same for Eletrobras. So that's about coordination. If you have an instrument that is powerful and capable of inducing and coordinating a transition process, an investment process towards what you want, this is what you need to do. Thank you. Professor Nelson. I understand that the role of agencies, multilateral agencies, international agencies, and that their role in the national system, national development system, is very important, and I believe they will be interested in participating in our program. We leave room for these organizations because we can see clearly in the actions of such organizations that they are concerned with financing precisely activities that are sustainable, that generate sustainability and social inclusion, also digital inclusion, with a view to social inclusion, obviously. And so all these actions are compatible with the priorities of such agencies. And for us, since the priorities of this plan are also the priorities of our plan, and there's this interest on the part of our agencies, there is complete alignment, and we understand that this is a very important source of funding that we should rely on, and that states and municipalities also need to be relied on, or need to rely on it as well. And I believe that towards this end, the ABDE and the National Development System have important roles in raising the capacity of states and municipalities in order to seek these resources and structure the next requests and projects. Our diagnosis reveals that states and municipalities have difficulty designing projects and complying with requirements in order to access such funding, which is very important for development. And so I believe that it would be important to play this role. ABDE should play the role of training, increasing capacity of states and municipalities through this network of agencies, and also the BNDES and state agencies, in order to help and support them in this endeavor. Of course, innovative instruments, as already mentioned here, and also specific instruments such as credit lines and special interest rates for sustainable development. And lastly, we should be able to raise the funds for sustainable development, and well, that's it. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Nelson. Zeina, I will repeat some of the points that have already been raised. There is no recipe in terms of financial engineering and financial instruments to be used. There is no recipe, ready-made recipe, but there is a lot on the table, and so this is the least of our challenges. As already mentioned, good projects that are actually designed based on appropriate diagnosis with cost-benefit analyses and capacity, effective delivery capacity and effective programs will find financing. It will be possible to cooperate, to have cooperation between the private sector and multilateral banks, and so this is very important. When we talk with investors abroad, we see that there is interest in Brazil, if not now, but in general. The issue is we don't have good projects. And added to this, the legal uncertainty in the country makes things very difficult. And we talk about the entry of resources in the country and partnerships with foreign investors. We need to remember also pension funds. In order for them to come to Brazil, we need to sort out our fiscal issues. Otherwise, we will not be able to attract such resources. And we mustn't forget that Brazilian resources are actually leaving the country because of a difficult business environment. And so it's about, first, these agendas need to be inserted within a broader government plan, because the issue of financing is feasible. It's feasible, and we can increase our capacity to attract resources. When we look at direct foreign investment, we have been losing participation. We have been losing our share from this world pool of foreign direct investment. And it's not only about green fields. There is some homework that we need to do, which is to design good projects and make sure that they are feasible. When we look at public works, for instance, the Court of Accounts, the Federal Court of Accounts, points out that many of these projects are not good quality.
Of course, there's no fixed recipe, so depending on the area, that is a matter of it being more of an internal effort. So it's harder to establish partnerships and designs of financial engineering that involves other agents, other economic agents. And one point put forth by Nelson is innovation. So there is also a part of innovation in our document referring to startups, research, development, and universities and other topics of innovation that needs to receive input from public policy. It's one of the classic examples in the literature because the success rate is very low. So when you innovate, the risk of it not working is very huge. So you need the state helping in this process, and when it works, that translates into a benefit to society. Zeina, your time is up. So we need higher quality of education that goes through the capacity building of professors. So So each case will be different, but I don't think it's that difficult to attract partnerships with the private sector, multilateral institutions. Thank you, Zeina. I'll give you 1 minute for your final remarks. I will break protocol. Everybody's looking at me right now, but it's important for you to make some closing remarks. Well, since I went overboard in my previous participation, I will be very brief. I'm very grateful for being here. It's very important to have a debate. I think there's an important role to be played by development institutions, especially after the pandemic. There are urgent things that need to be addressed, and I would highlight that, stress that point. But we should be very careful with the use of public resources, and we need, in general terms, to be very careful with the design of state interventions in society. Thank you. Thank you, Zeina, Professor Nelson. I would also like to thank my colleagues for the debate, and thank you for organizing this event. It's been a great opportunity to exchange some ideas. This topic is very important, so I'd like to say that development programs are essential for any country. A well-structured program that puts the public and the private sector in line with the actions and with a well-structured development system is fundamental. So your work is fundamental. I've made a few suggestions in terms of innovation, in terms of adoption of the Office of Projects. And like Zeina was saying, and Guilherme as well, we have the observation of the rigor with public funds. The usage of public funds is very important. So the role of the agencies is fundamental for us to have development in the country, and this system is to be congratulated, and congratulations for this initiative. It is a well-structured system, so you need a strategy, and this is what you're trying to put together. Congratulations on your initiative, and this is my final message to you. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Professor Nelson. Guilherme? I would also like to thank for the invitation of ABDE on behalf of José Gordon, who invited me to be here. I'd like to thank all of the all of my fellow panelists, debaters. Very good debates always, and I'd like to point towards the synergy that we managed to build in this debate. So the importance of this document was made clear to everyone, even though we have our differences in perspectives about the development model or whatever it is. We've identified many aspects of the program that will match and contribute with the debates that we'll have a few months from now. I'd like this debate to continue. I'm very much interested in participating in these debates because the environmental and the social themes are the two big topics that we have had that might lead the country to rebuild its productive structure. And with that, we can resume the debates based on the points that have been presented. Governor, thank you once again. Actually, I had the opportunity throughout my public life to follow the role of development banks. In my state, BRDE is a bank that develops 4 states, Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Paraná, and then Mato Grosso do Sul came. In my state, there is BADESUL, there is Banrisul, a commercial bank, so I know of the importance of development banks and public banks and development institutions. I know that they have a very different role than the private sector has, the financial private institutions, and this role has to do with what we need at this moment: sustainable development, social inclusion. We have not addressed as much what represents within the sustainable development the need to have heavier investment in clean energy We are still very incipient in PV and solar, and our country is very solar rich, and we addressed very little of one of the points of the document, which is this digitization. When we see the expansion of distance education, when we see the changes in medicine that were made very clear in the pandemic, the digitization of the public and the private sector are very important and have everything to do with the work of development institutions. So thank you very much. This document will serve as a baseline for the work we are developing, and I am at your disposal for anything I can help you with in our team and everyone that's working in a government program, and which will not sell any illusions but will aim to show a new pathway ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank on behalf of the members of the ABDE for this debate, and this plan is just the beginning. It's not an end in itself. It's just the beginning of the of our contribution to a development agenda. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a great event. Thank you very much to all of the participants of our first panel.